The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the general store, and Katherine Irving watched through dust-caked eyelashes as the driver climbed down, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud that seemed to echo her own exhaustion. She had been traveling for 3 weeks, crossing half a continent to reach this Montana Territory town of Bozeman in the summer of 1878, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride that had promised a new life, a fresh start, and a man named Kenneth Ingram who claimed to own a prosperous ranch. The tears had started somewhere in Wyoming, when she realized she had left everything familiar behind and was hurtling toward a complete unknown. They had not stopped since, leaving clean tracks down her dusty cheeks, and now as she gathered her worn carpetbag and prepared to step down from the coach, she felt the full weight of her decision pressing against her chest like a stone. "Miss Reynolds." The driver's voice was gruff, but not unkind as he offered his weathered hand to help her down. "This is your stop, Grace Reynolds." The name felt new even though it had been hers for 22 years. She took the driver's hand and stepped onto the wooden platform, her legs trembling from days of sitting and her feet aching in boots that had seen better days. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly, and the dust from the streets seemed to coat everything, including the air she breathed. She looked around the small frontier town with wide eyes, taking in the wooden buildings that lined the main street, the horses tied to hitching posts, and the mountains rising in the distance like sentinels guarding this wild place. Bozeman was smaller than she had imagined, rougher, more real than the romanticized vision she had carried in her mind during the endless journey west. "You waiting for someone?" the driver asked, already hauling her trunk down from the coach's roof. "Yes," Grace said, her voice hoarse from lack of use. "A Mr. Kenneth Ingram. He was supposed to meet me here." The driver set her trunk down with a thump and looked around the street. Several men loitered outside the saloon, and a woman in a fine dress was coming out of the mercantile, but no one seemed to be waiting for a travel-worn bride. "Don't see nobody looking particularly expectant," he said. "You sure he knew you were coming today?" Grace fumbled in her reticule and pulled out a crumpled letter, the paper worn soft from repeated readings. "He said he would be here when the Tuesday coach arrived." "It is Tuesday, is it not?" "Tuesday it is," the driver confirmed, then tipped his hat. "Well, I hope he shows, miss." "Good luck to you." With that, he climbed back onto the coach, and within moments the horses were pulling away, leaving Grace standing alone on the platform with her belongings and a growing sense of dread. She waited. The sun climbed higher, and the dust devils danced in the street. People passed by, some glancing at her with curiosity, others with pity. A mail-order bride waiting for a man who had not come was not an uncommon sight in these western towns, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the humiliation burning in Grace's chest. An hour passed. Then 2. Grace's feet throbbed in her boots, and the tears that had dried during the wait threatened to return. She sat down on her trunk, no longer caring what the townspeople thought, and stared at the letter in her hands. Kenneth Ingram's handwriting was neat and confident, his words promising. He had written about his ranch, his cattle, his need for a good woman to share his life. He had seemed honest, decent, and Grace had let herself hope. "Excuse me, miss." Grace looked up to find a tall man standing before her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He removed the hat, revealing dark hair and brown eyes that held a mixture of concern and something else she could not quite identify. "Are you Miss Reynolds?" he asked. Hope flared in Grace's chest. "Yes, I am. Are you Mr. Ingram?" The man's expression shifted, and the hope inside Grace began to crumble even before he spoke. "No, miss. My name is Kyle Ingram. Kenneth was my brother. Was." The past tense hit Grace like a physical blow. She stood up quickly, her legs unsteady. Was. Kyle Ingram looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. Kenneth passed away 3 weeks ago. A riding accident. His horse spooked during a storm, threw him, and he hit his head on a rock. He never woke up. The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. 3 weeks ago. That would have been just as she was leaving Boston, selling the few belongings she had left after her father's death, burning her bridges and setting out for a future that no longer existed. "I see," she heard herself say, though the words sounded distant and strange. "I am sorry," Kyle said, and his voice held genuine remorse. "Kenneth's death was sudden, and in the confusion afterward I did not think about his correspondence. I did not know he had sent for a bride until I found your letters in his desk this morning. I came to town hoping to send you a telegram before you left Boston, but I was too late." Grace nodded slowly, trying to process this information through the fog of shock and exhaustion. "I understand. Thank you for coming to tell me." She looked at her trunk, her carpet bag, and tried to think what to do next. She had spent nearly all her money on the journey west. She had no family left in Boston, no home to return to. She was stranded in a Montana Territory town with a dead man's brother standing before her and nowhere to go. The tears she had been fighting all day finally won. They spilled down her cheeks, cutting through the dust, and she could not stop them. All the grief of losing her father 6 months ago, all the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, all the crushing disappointment of this moment came pouring out in silent, shaking sobs. Kyle Ingram stood there for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. Then he said quietly, "Miss Reynolds, please do not cry. We will figure something out." But Grace could not stop. She sank back down onto her trunk, covered her face with her hands, and let herself break apart right there on the platform in front of the general store in Bozeman, Montana. She felt a hand on her shoulder, tentative and awkward. "Miss Reynolds," Kyle said again, "come with me. Let me help you." Grace shook her head without looking up. "You have done enough. You told me about your brother. I will manage somehow." "You are exhausted and upset," Kyle said firmly. "You cannot stay here on this platform. Please let me take you to the ranch. You can rest, clean up, and we will figure out what to do next. I owe Kenneth that much, and I owe you an apology for not sending word sooner." Grace finally looked up at him through her tears. Kyle Ingram was perhaps 26 or 27, with a weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors and eyes that, despite the awkwardness of the situation, seemed kind. He looked nothing like the description Kenneth had given of himself in his letters, but there was a family resemblance in the shape of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. "I cannot impose on you," Grace said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew she had no real alternative. "It is not an imposition," Kyle replied. "My brother made you a promise, and his death does not erase your need or your circumstances. Please let me help, at least for tonight." Grace wanted to refuse. She wanted to be strong and independent and capable of solving this problem herself. But the truth was that she was none of those things in this moment. She was tired and heartbroken and so very, very lost. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." Kyle picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing and nodded toward a wagon parked near the mercantile. "The ranch is about an hour outside of town. It is a good place. Kenneth loved it." Grace followed him to the wagon, her feet dragging with each step. Kyle loaded her trunk into the back, then helped her up onto the seat. His hands were calloused and strong, and he handled her with a gentleness that surprised her. As they pulled out of town, Grace looked back at Bozeman, watching the buildings grow smaller. She had arrived covered in dust and tears, expecting to meet her future husband, and instead she had found death and uncertainty. The irony was not lost on her. The landscape rolled past in shades of gold and green, the mountains standing purple against the sky. Montana was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that Grace had never experienced before. Boston had been all cobblestones and brick buildings, confined spaces and rigid social structures. This was something else entirely, vast and open and a little frightening. Kyle did not speak much during the drive, for which Grace was grateful. She was too wrung out for conversation, too aware of her own disheveled appearance and the awkwardness of the situation. Here she was, sitting beside a stranger, heading to his ranch because his dead brother had summoned her across the country for a marriage that would never happen. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill, and Grace felt something shift in her chest. It was a solid structure of wood and stone, not large but well built, with a covered porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. Behind it were a barn and several outbuildings, and beyond that, fields where cattle grazed. Kenneth had not lied about his property. It was indeed prosperous. Kyle pulled the wagon up in front of the house and helped Grace down. Her legs had stiffened during the ride, and when her feet hit the ground, she stumbled slightly. Kyle caught her arm to steady her, and she murmured a thank you. "Come inside," he said. "You must be thirsty." The inside of the house was simple but clean, with furniture that looked handmade and sturdy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and through a doorway, Grace could see a kitchen. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. Kyle gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "Please sit down." Grace sat, and the relief of being off her feet was almost overwhelming. She watched as Kyle disappeared into the kitchen, heard the sound of water being poured, and then he returned with a cup that he handed to her. She drank gratefully, the water cool and sweet. Kyle stood awkwardly for a moment, then said, "Miss Reynolds, I know this is an impossible situation, but I want you to know that you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. There is a spare room, Kenneth's room, and you can rest and recover from your journey." Grace set down the cup and looked at him. "That is very kind, but I cannot stay here indefinitely. It would not be proper, and besides, you have your own life. I will need to find work, a place to live." "There is time to figure that out," Kyle said. "But right now, you look ready to collapse. Let me show you the room and you can clean up and rest." Grace wanted to protest again, but the truth was that she was ready to collapse. The exhaustion was bone deep, and the emotional toll of the day had left her feeling hollow. "All right," she said, "but just for tonight." Kyle led her down a short hallway to a bedroom. It was modest but comfortable, with a bed covered in a quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. "I will bring in your trunk," Kyle said. "There is water in the pitcher, and I will heat some more if you would like to wash." "Thank you," Grace said. "That would be very kind." Kyle nodded and left. Grace stood in the middle of the room, looking around at what would have been her husband's space. There were few personal items, just some books on a shelf and a pair of boots by the door. It struck her suddenly that Kenneth Ingram had been a real person, not just words on a page, and now he was gone. She had never met him, but she felt a strange grief for the life they might have had. Kyle returned with her trunk and set it at the foot of the bed. "I will heat water for a bath," he said. "Give me a few minutes." Grace sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her boots, pulling them off with a wince. Her feet were swollen and blistered, and when she peeled off her stockings, she saw that they were bleeding in places. The journey had been harder on her body than she had realized. Kyle returned carrying a large basin of steaming water. He set it down on the floor near the washstand, then froze when he saw Grace's feet. His expression changed, something fierce and protective flashing across his face. "Miss Reynolds, your feet." Grace looked down, suddenly embarrassed. "The journey was long. They will heal." Kyle shook his head. "They need tending." He disappeared again before Grace could protest and returned with a clean cloth, some salve, and a stool. He set the stool in front of Grace and knelt down, rolling up his sleeves. "What are you doing?" Grace asked, startled. "Your feet need to be cleaned and treated," Kyle said matter-of-factly. "You cannot do it properly yourself, not with how swollen they are." "Mr. Ingram, I cannot ask you to do that. It is not appropriate." Kyle looked up at her, and his eyes were steady and serious. "Miss Reynolds, you came all this way because my brother made you a promise. He is not here to keep that promise, but I am. The least I can do is help you now. Please, let me." There was something in his voice that made Grace stop protesting. She nodded slowly, and Kyle gently lifted her right foot, placing it in the basin of warm water. Grace gasped at the initial sting, then relaxed as the warmth began to soothe the ache. Kyle worked quietly, carefully washing away the dust and blood, his touch surprisingly gentle for such work-hardened hands. Grace watched him, this stranger who was showing her more kindness than she had any right to expect. His dark hair fell forward as he bent over his task, and she noticed the strong line of his jaw, the concentration in his expression. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Kyle was quiet for a moment, rinsing the cloth in the water. "My mother died when I was 12, he said finally. "Kenneth was only 7. Our father was not a gentle man, and those years after she died were hard. Kenneth took care of me in small ways, made things easier when he could. He was a good brother." He looked up at her. "When I found your letters this morning and realized what had happened, I felt like I had failed him. I should have gone through his desk sooner, should have found your correspondence and sent word. You should not have made this journey only to find disappointment." "It is not your fault," Grace said. "You could not have known." "Perhaps not," Kyle said, moving to her left foot, "but I can help you now. That much is within my power." He continued working, cleaning the blisters and applying the salve with careful attention. Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were not entirely from sadness. There was something deeply moving about this act of service, this man kneeling before her and tending to her wounds with such care. When he finished, Kyle wrapped her feet in clean cloth and looked up at her. "There, that should help them heal. Try to stay off them for a day or two." "Thank you," Grace whispered. "I do not know how to repay such kindness." Kyle stood and picked up the basin. "There is no debt. You have had a terrible day and you are far from home. Anyone would do the same." But Grace knew that was not true. Many people would not have done the same. Many men would have simply told her about Kenneth's death and left her to fend for herself in a strange town. Kyle Ingram was doing something different, something more, and she did not fully understand why. After he left, Grace cleaned herself as best she could with the remaining warm water, washing the dust from her face and arms, unpinning her hair and brushing it out. She found a clean nightgown in her trunk and changed into it, then climbed into the bed. The mattress was more comfortable than she had expected, and the quilt smelled of sage and sunshine. She should have felt strange, sleeping in a dead man's bed in a stranger's house. But instead, she felt only exhaustion dragging her down into darkness. The last thing she thought before sleep claimed her was how gentle Kyle's hands had been, and how he had looked at her feet with such concern, as though she mattered, as though she was worth caring for. She slept deeply, without dreams, and when she woke, the room was filled with the soft light of early morning. For a moment she forgot where she was, then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up slowly, testing her feet. They still hurt, but less than before, and when she unwrapped the cloth, she saw that the salve had worked wonders. There was a soft knock on the door. "Miss Reynolds, are you awake?" "Yes," Grace called, quickly pulling on her dressing gown. "I have left some breakfast outside your door," Kyle said. "Take your time. There is no rush. Grace opened the door to find a tray with bread, butter, jam, and coffee. The thoughtfulness of it made her chest tight. She carried the tray to the bed and ate slowly, savoring each bite. The bread was fresh, and the coffee was strong and hot. It was the best meal she had eaten in weeks. After she finished, Grace dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, a gray cotton that was practical but becoming. She pinned up her hair and studied herself in the small mirror above the dresser. She looked better than yesterday, though still tired and uncertain. When she ventured out of the bedroom, she found Kyle in the kitchen, washing dishes. He looked up when she entered and gave her a small smile. "Good morning. How are your feet?" "Much better, thank you," Grace said, "and thank you for the breakfast. It was delicious." "I am not much of a cook," Kyle admitted, "but I can manage bread and coffee." He dried his hands on a towel. "Miss Reynolds, I have been thinking about your situation. If you need work, there are opportunities in town. The schoolteacher position is open and the hotel is always looking for help. I can take you into Bozeman tomorrow if you would like, introduce you to some people." Grace nodded. "That would be helpful. I will need to support myself somehow." Kyle hesitated, then said, "There is another option, though I know it is forward of me to suggest it." Grace waited, curious. "You came here to marry a rancher," Kyle said carefully. "Kenneth is gone, but I am still here. The ranch is doing well, but it is a lot of work for one man and I could use help. If you were willing, we could make the same arrangement you had with Kenneth. A marriage of practicality, a partnership." Grace stared at him, shocked. "You are proposing to me?" Kyle's ears reddened slightly. "Not in the romantic sense. I am suggesting a practical solution to both our problems. You need a home and security. I need help with the ranch and eventually a family. It would be a business arrangement like what you planned with Kenneth." "We have known each other less than a day," Grace said. "That is true," Kyle agreed. "And I am not asking for an answer now. I just wanted you to know the option exists. Think about it. In the meantime, please stay here as my guest. The spare room is yours for as long as you need it." Grace did not know what to say. The offer was shocking in its suddenness, yet also strangely logical. She had come west to marry a stranger and build a life. Did it matter so much that the stranger was Kenneth's brother instead of Kenneth himself? But the idea of entering into such an arrangement felt cold, calculated, even though her agreement with Kenneth had been the same. "I will think about it," she said finally. "But Mr. Ingram, I need time. I need to understand my options and make a clear-headed decision." "Of course," Kyle said. "And please call me Kyle. Mr. Ingram sounds too formal for people sharing a house." "Then you must call me Grace," she replied. Over the following days, Grace settled into a strange new routine. Kyle was respectful and courteous, giving her space while also including her in the rhythms of ranch life. He showed her around the property, introduced her to the animals, and explained his plans for the land. Grace found herself genuinely interested, asking questions and offering observations. She also helped with the household chores, insisting on earning her keep even though Kyle protested. She cooked meals, mended clothes, and cleaned the house. It felt good to be useful, to have purpose again after weeks of aimless travel. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. Kyle was not much of a talker, but Grace found that she did not mind the silence. It was comfortable, peaceful, and so different from the constant noise of Boston. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Grace finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Tell me about Kenneth." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky. "Kenneth was a dreamer," he said finally. "He always had big plans, ideas about how to make the ranch better, how to expand. He was enthusiastic about everything, optimistic, sometimes too optimistic." "What do you mean?" He did not always think things through, Kyle said. He would get an idea and rush into it without considering the consequences. Our father was the same way, which is why he lost most of his money before he died. Kenneth inherited that trait. But the ranch is successful, Grace observed. That is because I am practical, Kyle said with a slight smile. Kenneth provided the vision and I provided the reality check. We balanced each other out. Without him, the ranch feels too grounded. Without me, Kenneth would have been bankrupt within a year. It was a good partnership. You must miss him terribly, Grace said softly. I do, Kyle admitted. Every day, especially in the evenings when we would sit out here and talk about the next day's work or argue about whether to buy new breeding stock. He glanced at Grace. I am sorry again that you never got to meet him. He would have liked you. How can you know that? Because you are kind and intelligent and adaptable, Kyle said. Those were the qualities he said he wanted in a wife. He was tired of the superficial women in town who only cared about parties and gossip. He wanted someone with substance. Grace felt herself flush at the compliment. I hope I would have met his expectations. You exceed them, Kyle said quietly, then seemed to realize what he had said and cleared his throat. What I mean is, you are handling this difficult situation with grace. No pun intended. Grace laughed, surprising herself. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving in Montana, and it felt good. That was terrible, Kyle grinned. Kenneth was better at wordplay than I am. They sat in companionable silence after that, and Grace found herself thinking about Kyle's proposal. It still felt sudden and strange, but she was beginning to see the logic in it. She enjoyed the ranch, enjoyed the work and the wide open spaces. She felt comfortable with Kyle, safe in his presence. He was steady and reliable, qualities she had not realized she valued so highly until now. But was comfort and safety enough? She had agreed to marry Kenneth without love, but that had felt different somehow. Kenneth had been a romantic prospect, at least in her imagination. Kyle was real and present, and entering into a loveless marriage with him felt more daunting because she could see him, talk to him, and know exactly what she was committing to. Another week passed, and Grace fell more deeply into the rhythm of ranch life. She learned to milk the cow, feed the chickens, and tend the vegetable garden behind the house. She rode with Kyle to check on the cattle, sitting on a gentle mare named Daisy and marveling at the vast beauty of the Montana landscape. She also began to notice things about Kyle that she had not seen at first. The way he was gentle with the animals, speaking softly to the horses and never using his strength to dominate them. The way he was fair with the ranch hands, treating them with respect and paying them honestly. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, his expression thoughtful and a little sad. One afternoon, Grace was in the kitchen making bread when she heard a commotion outside. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, finding Kyle talking to a man she did not recognize. The stranger was rough-looking, with greasy hair and clothes that had seen better days. I am telling you, Ingram, Kenneth owed me money, the man was saying, his voice loud and aggressive. $200 from a poker game last month. He died before he could pay up, so the debt falls to you. Kyle's expression was carefully neutral. I have been through all of Kenneth's papers, Garrett. There is no record of any debt to you. That is because it was a private game, Garrett sneered. But I have witnesses. You can ask anyone who was there. Then bring me those witnesses, Kyle said calmly. If you can prove the debt is legitimate, I will pay it, but I am not handing over $200 on your word alone. Garrett took a step closer, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. You calling me a liar? Grace felt her heart leap into her throat, but Kyle did not back down. I am saying I need proof. That is reasonable. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Grace held her breath, afraid of what might happen. Then Garrett spat in the dirt and turned away. "You have not heard the last of this, Ingram. I will be back with those witnesses, and then you will pay what is owed." He mounted his horse and rode off in a cloud of dust. Kyle stood watching him go, his shoulders tight, then turned and saw Grace in the doorway. His expression softened. "You should not have to witness that." "Who was that man?" Grace asked. "Dan Garrett. He is a gambler and a troublemaker. He has been trying to get money out of me since Kenneth died, claiming various debts and promises." Kyle walked to the porch and leaned against the railing. "Kenneth did like to play poker, and he was not very good at it. It is possible he owed Garrett money, but I doubt it was $200. More likely Garrett is trying to take advantage of the situation." "What will you do if he comes back with witnesses?" "Pay him if the witnesses are credible," Kyle said. "And if they are not, refuse again. I will not be cheated, but I will honor Kenneth's legitimate debts." Grace could see the weight of responsibility on Kyle's shoulders, the burden of being the one left behind to sort out his brother's affairs and deal with men like Garrett. "You are a good man," she said impulsively. Kyle looked surprised. "I am just trying to do the right thing." "That is what makes you good," Grace replied. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding and connection that made Grace's breath catch. Then Kyle looked away, and the moment was broken. "I should get back to work. I promised the hands I would help with the fence repairs today." After he left, Grace returned to her bread making, but her mind was churning. She was beginning to feel things for Kyle that she had not anticipated, a warmth and attraction that went beyond gratitude and respect. The thought frightened her, because it made his proposal more complicated. It was one thing to enter into a practical marriage with no expectations of love. It was quite another to marry someone she was starting to care for deeply, knowing he only saw her as a solution to a problem. That evening, as they sat on the porch again, Grace made a decision. "Kyle, I have been thinking about your proposal." Kyle turned to her, his expression guarded. "And I would like to accept," Grace said, "but with certain conditions." "What conditions?" Grace took a deep breath. "I want time for us to truly know each other before we marry. At least a few more weeks. I want to be sure this is the right decision for both of us. And I want honesty between us. If at any point either of us feels this is not working, we should be free to say so without guilt." Kyle was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Those seem like reasonable conditions. I agree." "There is one more thing," Grace said. "I do not want a marriage that is only practical. I want there to be at least the possibility of affection, of real partnership. I am not asking for grand romance, but I want us to be friends, to care about each other. Can you agree to that?" Kyle met her eyes, and she saw something shift in his expression. "I can agree to that," he said softly. "In fact, I would prefer it. I have seen loveless marriages, Grace. My parents had one. It was cold and miserable. I would not want that for us." Grace felt relief wash through her. "Then we are agreed. We will take these next weeks to know each other better, and if we still feel this is right, we will marry." Kyle extended his hand, and Grace took it. His grip was warm and firm, and he held her hand perhaps a moment longer than necessary before letting go. "Thank you," he said, "for giving this a chance, for giving me a chance." "Thank you for offering it," Grace replied. The next weeks were some of the happiest Grace could remember. She and Kyle spent their days working side by side, and their evenings talking on the porch or by the fireplace. They discussed everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Grace learned that Kyle had once wanted to be a lawyer, but had given up that dream when his father died, and Kenneth needed help with the ranch. Kyle learned that Grace had worked as a seamstress in Boston after her father's death, barely making enough to survive, until she saw Kenneth's advertisement and decided to take a chance on a new life. They also laughed together, something Grace had not expected. Kyle had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and she found herself looking forward to his quiet observations about life on the ranch or the eccentric characters in Bozeman. One Sunday, they attended church in town together. Grace felt the curious stares of the other worshippers, knew they were speculating about her presence and her relationship to Kyle. After the service, several women approached her with thinly veiled questions, and Kyle stayed close, his hand at her elbow, protective. "So you are Kenneth's intended," one older woman said, her eyes sharp. "Such a shame what happened, and now you are staying with Kyle. That must be awkward." "Kyle has been very kind," Grace said evenly. "He is helping me adjust to Montana." "I am sure he is," the woman said with a knowing look that made Grace's cheeks burn. On the ride back to the ranch, Kyle apologized. "I am sorry about that. The gossips in this town have nothing better to do than speculate about other people's business." "It is all right," Grace said. "I understand their curiosity. The situation is unusual." "Still," Kyle said, "I do not like people talking about you as though you are fodder for their entertainment." Grace looked at him, touched by his defense of her. "You are protective. You are under my roof and under my care," Kyle said. "That makes you my responsibility." "Is that all I am?" Grace asked quietly. "A responsibility." Kyle pulled the wagon to a stop on the side of the road and turned to face her. "No," he said. "You are not just a responsibility, Grace. These past weeks, you have become important to me. I look forward to seeing you each morning, to talking with you each evening. I admire your strength and your resilience. You came here expecting one life and found something completely different, and you have handled it with more grace than I could have imagined." Grace's heart was pounding. "Kyle, I need to tell you something. When I agreed to consider your proposal, I thought it would be a practical arrangement like what I planned with Kenneth. But it has become something more for me. I care about you. I care about you in a way that is starting to frighten me because I do not know if you feel the same." Kyle reached out and took her hand. "I feel the same," he said. "I did not expect to, but I do. You have become more than a solution to a problem, Grace. You have become someone I cannot imagine living without." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "Really, really," Kyle said. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that it made Grace's breath catch. "Grace Reynolds, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not out of obligation or practicality, but because I want to share my life with you, because I am falling in love with you." "Yes," Grace whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Kyle Ingram." Kyle smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face, and then he was leaning forward and Grace was meeting him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was sweet and full of promise, and Grace felt as though she was finally, truly home. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Bozeman. Grace wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Kyle had bought her at the mercantile, a soft blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Kyle wore his best suit, and he looked so handsome that Grace could hardly believe he was hers. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of ranch hands and a few townsfolk who had befriended them. Grace spoke her vows with a clear voice, meaning every word, and when Kyle slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she felt tears of happiness slide down her cheeks. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the ranch. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter and more happiness than Grace had known in years. She danced with Kyle under the Montana sky, his arms strong around her, and felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be. That night, when they retired to their bedroom, Kyle's bedroom that was now theirs, Kyle took her face in his hands and kissed her gently. "I know this has all happened quickly," he said. "We can take things slowly at whatever pace you are comfortable with." Grace put her hands over his. "I am comfortable with you," she said. "I trust you, Kyle, completely." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Grace gave herself over to the moment, to the joy of being loved and wanted. Kyle was tender and patient, treating her like something precious, and Grace marveled at how different this was from what she had expected. She had thought marriage would be duty and obligation, but with Kyle, it felt like coming home. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Kyle's arms around her, Grace said softly, "When I arrived in Bozeman covered in dust and tears, I thought my life was over. I thought I had made a terrible mistake. And now?" Kyle asked. "Now I think it was the best decision I ever made," Grace said. "I just did not know it at the time." Kyle kissed her forehead. "When I saw you that day on the platform, so lost and heartbroken, something in me shifted. I wanted to protect you, to help you, but more than that, I wanted to know you. I wanted to understand what kind of woman would travel across the country to marry a stranger. You were brave, Grace. You are brave." "I did not feel brave," Grace admitted. "I felt terrified." "Bravery is not the absence of fear," Kyle said. "It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You are one of the bravest people I know." Grace snuggled closer to him, breathing in his scent of soap and leather and the outdoors. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily, naturally. "I love you too," Kyle replied. "More than I thought possible." The months that followed were filled with hard work and deep contentment. Grace threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, sewing curtains and quilts, planting flowers around the porch, and learning to cook the hearty meals that fueled ranch work. She also learned to be a true partner to Kyle, helping with the cattle during roundups, keeping the ranch books, and handling correspondence with buyers. The townspeople of Bozeman gradually accepted Grace as Kyle's wife, and she made friends among the other ranch wives. She joined the church ladies' auxiliary and helped organize a harvest festival. Montana was becoming home in a way Boston never had been, and Grace found herself grateful for the twist of fate that had brought her here. One afternoon in late autumn, as Grace was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up to see Dan Garrett riding toward the house with two other men. Her stomach clenched with worry. Kyle was out on the range checking on the cattle, and she was alone. Garrett dismounted and swaggered toward her, a mean smile on his face. "Well, if it is not the mail-order bride turned Mrs. Where is your husband?" "He is working," Grace said, keeping her voice steady. "What do you want, Mr. Garrett?" "I came for the money your husband owes me," Garrett said. "I have brought my witnesses just like I said I would." The two men with him nodded. One of them said, "Kenneth Ingram lost $200 to Dan in a poker game. I was there. I saw it." Grace looked at them carefully. They were clearly friends of Garrett's, and their testimony was worth nothing. "Kyle said he would pay legitimate debts if you could prove them. These men are your associates. They are not impartial witnesses." Garrett's expression darkened. "You calling us liars?" "I am saying Kyle is not here, and I cannot give you money without his approval," Grace said. "You will have to come back another time." "I am tired of waiting," Garrett said. He took a step toward Grace, and she instinctively backed up. "Maybe you could find a way to be more hospitable. Maybe we could work out a different arrangement." The implication in his words made Grace's skin crawl. "Get off this property," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Now," Garrett laughed. "Or what? You will scream?" "There is nobody around to hear you, little lady." Grace's mind raced. She knew Kyle kept a rifle by the door, but she would have to get past Garrett to reach it. She was calculating her chances when she heard the sound of more horses approaching. Kyle appeared around the corner of the house, his face thunderous. With him were two of the ranch hands, both armed. "Garrett," Kyle said, his voice cold. "Get away from my wife." Garrett turned, his hand moving toward his gun, but Kyle was faster. He had his rifle up and pointed at Garrett before the other man could draw. "Do not," Kyle said quietly. "I would hate to shoot you, but I will if you threaten Grace." Garrett froze, then slowly moved his hand away from his gun. "I just came for the money you owe me." "I owe you nothing," Kyle said. "And you have been told to prove your claim through proper channels. Instead, you come to my home and threaten my wife. That was a mistake, Garrett." "I did not threaten her," Garrett protested. "I heard you," Kyle said. "And I know what you were implying. You have 30 seconds to get on your horse and leave this property. If I see you here again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Garrett looked at the three armed men facing him and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. "This is not over, Ingram." "Yes, it is," Kyle said. "Kenneth may have owed you money, though I doubt it, but even if he did, that debt died with him. I have checked with a lawyer. There is no legal claim you can make. Now get out." Garrett and his companions mounted their horses and rode off. Kyle immediately lowered his rifle and went to Grace, who was trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "No," Grace said. "He just frightened me. Kyle, I am sorry. I should have been more careful." "This is not your fault," Kyle said fiercely. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I should have been here. I should have anticipated that he might try something like this." "You cannot be everywhere at once," Grace said, her voice muffled against his chest. "From now on, when I have to be away from the house, one of the hands will stay behind," Kyle said. "I will not risk your safety again." Grace pulled back and looked up at him. "Kyle, we cannot live in fear. Garrett is a bully and a coward. He will not come back now that he knows you are willing to stand up to him." "Perhaps," Kyle said, but his expression was troubled. "But I cannot take that chance. You are too important to me." Grace kissed him softly. "And you are too important to me. But we will handle this together like we handle everything else." Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "So much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too," Grace replied. Garrett did not return, and as the weeks passed, Grace's fear faded. Winter came to Montana, bringing snow that blanketed the ranch in white and cold that bit through even the thickest coats. Grace and Kyle spent the long winter evenings by the fireplace, reading together or simply talking, and Grace felt more content than she ever had in her life. In early spring, Grace realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be sure before she told Kyle. When she finally did, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with joy, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "You have made me the happiest man alive, Grace. You are happy?" Grace asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Kyle said. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for everything. The pregnancy was not easy." Grace suffered from nausea in the early months and exhaustion throughout. Kyle was attentive and worried, hovering over her until she had to shoo him away so she could get her work done. But his concern touched her deeply, and she loved him even more for his protectiveness. In late autumn, Grace went into labor. The midwife from town came to the ranch, and Kyle paced outside the bedroom door for hours, nearly wearing a path in the floorboards. When he finally heard the cry of his child, he burst into the room, his face pale and anxious. "A son," the midwife announced, placing the baby in Grace's arms. "A healthy baby boy." Kyle sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at the tiny red-faced infant with an expression of awe. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Grace, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Kyle was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "What about Kenneth? After my brother. If it had not been for his advertisement, you never would have come to Montana and we never would have met. In a way, we owe him everything." Grace looked down at her son, then up at Kyle. "Kenneth it is," she said. "Kenneth Ingram, Jr. They called him Kenny, and he was the light of their lives. Kyle was a devoted father, patient and gentle, and Grace loved watching him with their son. As Kenny grew from an infant to a toddler, the ranch prospered. Kyle expanded their herd and bought more land, and Grace managed the household and the ranch finances with skill. 2 years after Kenny was born, Grace had another child, a daughter they named Rose. She had Grace's blonde hair and Kyle's brown eyes, and she was as spirited as her brother was thoughtful. The house was filled with the noise and chaos of children, and Grace would not have had it any other way. One evening, when Kenny was 5 and Rose was 3, Grace stood on the porch watching the sunset. Kyle came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You ever think about that day you arrived in Bozeman?" he asked. "Sometimes," Grace said. "I remember how scared and lost I felt, how certain I was that my life was ruined. And now," Grace turned in his arms and looked up at him, "now I know that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things. If Kenneth had not died, I never would have known you. I never would have had this life, this family. I cannot regret the path that brought me here." Kyle kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss full of love. "I think about that day too," he said. "I remember seeing you on that platform, covered in dust and tears, and thinking how beautiful you were. Not because of your appearance, though you are beautiful, but because of your courage. You had traveled so far and lost so much, and you were still standing. I knew right then that you were someone special. You called me beautiful even when I looked my worst," Grace said with a smile. "That should have been my first clue that you were a good man." "I meant it," Kyle said. "You were beautiful then, and you are beautiful now. You will always be beautiful to me, Grace." They stood together on the porch, holding each other as the sun set and the stars began to appear. Inside, they could hear Kenny and Rose playing, their laughter ringing through the house. The mountains stood tall in the distance, and the wind whispered through the grass. Grace thought about the long journey that had brought her here, all the miles and tears and uncertainty. She thought about Kenneth Ingram, the man she had never met who had inadvertently given her the greatest gift of her life. She thought about the moment Kyle had knelt before her and washed her feet, calling her beautiful when she felt anything but. That moment had changed everything. It had shown her that kindness existed in the world, that she was worth caring for, that there was hope even in the darkest circumstances. Kyle had seen past the dust and tears to the woman beneath, and he had chosen her. Not because she was convenient or because his brother had made a promise, but because he genuinely cared, and she had chosen him too. She had taken a chance on love when it would have been easier to run, and that chance had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. "I love you," Grace said, the words as true now as the first time she had spoken them. "I love you too," Kyle replied. "Always." Years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. The ranch thrived under Kyle and Grace's management, becoming one of the most successful in the region. They added to their family with another son, whom they named James, and the house rang with the sounds of children growing up. Kenny grew into a serious young man who loved books and learning. When he turned 18, he surprised his parents by announcing he wanted to attend college back east to become a lawyer. Kyle, remembering his own abandoned dreams, supported the decision wholeheartedly and found a way to pay for his son's education. Rose was spirited and adventurous, a born horsewoman who could ride as well as any ranch hand by the time she was 12. She had no interest in the traditional feminine pursuits that some of the town ladies tried to push on her, preferring to work alongside her father with the cattle. James was the peacemaker of the family, quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for understanding people. He wanted to stay on the ranch and eventually take over the family business, which pleased Kyle greatly. Grace watched her children grow with pride and sometimes a touch of melancholy, knowing that their childhood was fleeting and that they would eventually leave to build their own lives. But she also took joy in seeing the adults they were becoming, knowing that she and Kyle had raised them well. One afternoon, when Kenny was home from college for the summer and Rose was preparing to marry a young rancher from a neighboring property, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her family to this point. She was sitting on the porch, the same porch where she and Kyle had spent so many evenings talking and dreaming when Kyle came to join her. "You look thoughtful," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I was just thinking about how blessed we are," Grace said. 3 healthy children, a successful ranch, and each other. It is more than I ever dreamed of having. "We have been lucky," Kyle agreed, "but we have also worked hard for what we have. You especially, Grace. You took a terrible situation and made something beautiful from it." "We did it together," Grace corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you." Kyle reached over and took her hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her knuckles. His hair was gray now and there were lines around his eyes, but to Grace, he was as handsome as the day she had met him. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day?" he asked. "After I washed your feet," Grace smiled. "You said I was beautiful." "You did not believe me," Kyle said. "I could see it in your eyes. You thought I was just being kind or that I pitied you." "I did think that," Grace admitted. "I felt anything but beautiful that day." "But you were," Kyle insisted. "Not just in appearance, though even covered in dust and tears you were lovely, but beautiful in spirit, in courage, in resilience. I saw a woman who had been knocked down but had not given up. That kind of beauty is rare and precious." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You saw me when I could not see myself. You gave me hope when I had none left. That is why I fell in love with you, Kyle, because you made me believe I was worth loving." "You are worth loving," Kyle said firmly. "You always have been. I am just grateful I was the one who got to prove it to you." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun begin its descent. Inside, they could hear the sounds of their family, Kenny arguing good-naturedly with James about something, Rose laughing at whatever her brothers were saying. "I have no regrets," Grace said suddenly. "Not about leaving Boston, not about answering Kenneth's advertisement, not about staying here with you. Every choice I made led me to this moment, and I would not change a thing." "Neither would I," Kyle said. "Well, except perhaps I wish Kenneth could have lived to see all this." "He would have been happy for us." "I think he would," Grace agreed. "And I think, in a way, he is still part of our family. Kenny carries his name and his spirit. That is a kind of immortality." Kyle nodded. "Kenneth always said he wanted to leave a mark on the world." "I think he did, just not in the way he expected." As the evening deepened and the stars began to appear, Grace thought about the long arc of her life. She had left Boston as a desperate young woman with no prospects and no hope, answering an advertisement from a stranger because she had no other options. She had arrived in Montana broken and afraid, only to find that her intended husband was dead and her carefully laid plans were in ruins. But from those ruins, something wonderful had grown. Kyle had seen her at her lowest moment and had treated her with compassion and respect. He had washed her feet, a gesture so humble and yet so powerful that it had cracked open her heart. He had called her beautiful when she felt worthless, and he had given her time to heal and to choose her own path. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her. and together they had built a life that exceeded anything she could have imagined. They had faced hardships and challenges, dealt with difficult people like Dan Garrett, weathered the uncertainties of ranch life, and raised 3 children to adulthood. Through it all, their love had deepened and grown stronger. Grace realized that the dust and tears of that first day in Bozeman had been a kind of baptism, washing away her old life and preparing her for the new one that awaited. She had arrived as Grace Reynolds, a frightened mail-order bride, and had become Grace Ingram, a rancher's wife, a mother and a woman who had found her place in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Kyle asked, pulling her from her reverie. "About beginnings and endings," Grace said. "And about how sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a beginning in disguise." Kyle smiled. "That is very philosophical." "I am a very philosophical woman," Grace said with mock seriousness, then laughed. "Actually, I am just a woman who knows how lucky she is." "We are both lucky," Kyle said. He stood and pulled Grace to her feet, then wrapped his arms around her. "Dance with me." "There is no music," Grace protested, even as she moved into his embrace. "We do not need music," Kyle said, and he began to sway gently, moving her with him. Grace rested her head against his chest and let him lead, the two of them dancing slowly on the porch as the night settled around them. It was a perfect moment, simple and sweet, and Grace committed it to memory, wanting to remember this feeling of complete contentment. The years that followed brought more changes. Kenny finished college and returned to Montana with a law degree and a bride of his own, a bright young woman from Philadelphia who adapted to ranch life with surprising ease. He set up a law practice in Bozeman and became a respected member of the community, just as his father had once dreamed of doing. Rose married her rancher and moved to the neighboring property, close enough that Grace saw her often. She had 2 children in quick succession, both boys, and she raised them with the same independence and spirit that had defined her own childhood. James took over more and more of the ranch operations as Kyle grew older, proving to have his father's practical nature and his mother's head for business. He married a local girl, and they moved into a house they built on the edge of the Ingram property, close enough to help but far enough to have their own space. Kyle's health began to decline in his late 60s. The years of hard physical labor had taken their toll, and though his spirit was still strong, his body was wearing out. Grace nursed him through bouts of pneumonia and the aches and pains that came with age, and Kyle bore it all with patience and good humor. One spring evening, when the first wildflowers were blooming and the air was sweet with the scent of new grass, Kyle and Grace sat on their porch one last time. Kyle was wrapped in a blanket despite the mild temperature, and Grace sat close beside him, their hands clasped. "I have had a good life," Kyle said, his voice weaker than it had once been but still clear. "Better than I deserved." "Hush," Grace said. "You deserve every good thing." "I deserve you," Kyle said, "though I still do not know why I was so blessed. You could have left Montana after Kenneth died. You could have refused my proposal. You could have chosen any number of different paths. But you stayed, and you chose me, and you gave me a life I never could have had without you." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You are not allowed to get sentimental on me, Kyle Ingram. We have years left together." But they both knew that was not true. Kyle had been growing weaker, and they had both known this day was coming, even if they had not spoken of it. "Grace," Kyle said, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Grace said. "Promise me you will be happy after I am gone. Promise me you will not shut yourself away in grief but will live fully, surrounded by our children and grandchildren. Promise me you will remember the good times and not let the sorrow overwhelm the joy." "Kyle," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Promise me," Kyle insisted. "I promise," Grace whispered, "but I do not know how to be happy without you." "You are stronger than you think," Kyle said. "You always have been. From the moment you stepped off that stagecoach covered in dust and tears, I knew you were a survivor. You will survive this too." "I do not want to survive," Grace said. "I want you to stay." "I want that too," Kyle said gently. "But we do not always get what we want. What we do get is the time we have had together, and that has been enough. More than enough. You made me happier than I ever thought possible, Grace. Thank you for that." They sat in silence for a while, holding each other as the sun set and the stars appeared. Kyle's breathing grew more labored, and Grace knew the end was near. She held him close, whispering words of love, reminding him of all the beautiful moments they had shared. Kyle died peacefully just after midnight, with Grace holding his hand and their children gathered around. He slipped away quietly, a small smile on his face, as though he was seeing something beautiful that the rest of them could not yet see. Grace grieved deeply, but she kept her promise. She did not shut herself away but remained engaged with her family and the ranch. She found comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the rhythms of ranch life that she and Kyle had built together, and in the memories of their life together. She lived for another 15 years, watching her grandchildren grow and meeting her great-grandchildren. She remained sharp and engaged until the end, still managing the ranch books and offering advice to James when he asked for it. When Grace finally passed away at the age of 81, surrounded by her family in the house she had made a home, her last thoughts were of Kyle. She remembered the day she had arrived in Bozeman, broken and afraid, and how he had knelt before her and washed her feet and called her beautiful. She remembered every kiss, every laugh, every moment of joy and sorrow they had shared. And as she closed her eyes for the last time, she was smiling, because she knew that the story that had begun with dust and tears had ended with love and fulfillment. She had been blessed beyond measure, and she was grateful for every moment of the wild, beautiful life she had lived. The ranch remained in the Ingram family for generations after that, a testament to the love and hard work of Kyle and Grace. Their story became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the greatest blessings, and that true love can be found in the most unexpected places. In the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, 2 headstones stood side by side. One read Kenneth Ingram, and beneath his name were the words "Beloved Brother." The other 2 read Kyle Ingram and Grace Ingram, and beneath their names were the words "Together Forever." And on summer evenings, when the wind whispered through the grass and the mountains stood purple against the sky, it almost seemed as though you could see 2 figures standing on the porch of the old ranch house, holding each other and watching the sunset, their love enduring beyond death, beyond time, a beacon of hope for all who came after.